carried the title 3 Miles Up, Flying Saucers.
This year marks the 30th anniversary of the advent of the flying saucer. And that is a most unfortunate term, in my opinion, because it invites ridicule. It opens the door to a great deal of buffoonery and lampooning. It had a perfectly good history, because when Kenneth Arnold described the motions of the discs that he had seen, he said that it was like skipping a saucer over water. But some reporter thought that was a very clever term, and flying saucers were born. But it is really too bad, because it has caused a great deal of jokes and so forth. For instance, one common expression is that if you want to see a flying saucer, just goose the waitress.
What do experts believe UFOs look like?
Typically we're dealing with apparently round, symmetric, disc-shaped objects, definite size, shape, surface texture, bigger in diameter than they are in thickness, protuberances that might be landing gears or antenna, windows might be decorations too, we don't really know. Things with definite size, shape, surface texture. There are other reports of things that are cylindrical, long cigar-shaped objects. And if you look at the landing cases, and of course I'm most concerned with landing cases, because then we have something to work with. These are cases, landing trace cases, where a UFO is seen on or near the ground, and after it leaves, one finds physical changes produced in the environment. If you look at those cases, and one researcher has collected more than 1,000 such cases from 55 countries, and they're similar, whether you're dealing with sightings in Australia, New Zealand, you got the same landing traces as in the United States, as in South Africa, as in Canada, England, France, all over the world. There aren't any laws of physics that stand in the way of flying saucers, either getting here from other star systems or performing here once they're here. Many people think that you can't get here from there. The fact of the matter is that there are published studies by reputable engineers and scientists in good technical journals showing that trips to nearby stars, and I don't worry about the distant ones, are feasible with reasonable round-trip time, shorter than a person's lifetime, without violating any of the laws of physics, and using staged fission or fusion propulsion systems, on both of which I have worked. Now, we physically tested fission nuclear propulsion systems when I was at Westinghouse. In 1967, we tested the NRX-A6, less than 3 feet in diameter, power level 1,100 million watts. That's roughly the same energy it takes to light this, or to provide the electricity for the city of Perth.
As Perth, the City of Light, was viewed by Apollo astronauts, other UFO sightings were being made in Australia. Dr. Hynek's worldwide organization has a branch in Sydney, headed by Harry Griesberg and Bill Chalker. Sightings in Australia are so numerous that a special computer is needed to handle them.
And I work with computers. I got actively involved with the UFO Investigation Center after an experience of my own. We started out with a very small machine, which we were able to recover from scrap and make it do what we wanted to do with it. But since then the files have grown, and we now have several thousand files which we can look at and reference whenever we need. And this requires a much larger machine.
It's hard to imagine here in the middle of Sydney, amongst all this modern technology, how Fred Birmingham, a Parramatta surveyor, would have reacted to what he saw. He described seeing a strange aerial object shaped like an arc, moving in a zigzag manner and apparently landing in nearby Parramatta Park. What followed was a description of meeting a being he called a spirit, and an invitation to visit and walk on board this ark. It paralleled many stories that are similar to it right around the world, and you read about these stories in newspapers all the time, but this story in fact is what constitutes the first recorded close encounter in Australia, the date 1868. As an industrial chemist, I specialise in the study of what we term close encounters of the third kind. in this type of UFO sighting, an unidentified aerial object interacts with the physical environment, thereby leaving a permanent physical record of its presence.
What is the RAAF's official view of this? We visited them to find out. Squadron Leader White, you're with the Department of Defence here in Canberra. Is your function to deal with UFO inquiries entirely?
Only partly. In Air Force Office here I have several duties, one of which is to deal with what we prefer to call unusual aerial sightings.
Now you departed from UFO for any particular reason?
Yes, we think there's a fairly good reason to call them UFOs. The unidentified part of that statement is assuming immediately that we don't know what it is that people are seeing. Also objects, what people see are not necessarily objects. They can be weather factors, marsh gas, lightning, that sort of thing. The main problem that we see is the term UFO immediately conjures up in people's minds flying saucers, little green men.
Yeah.
So unusual aerial sightings we prefer.
Are there unusual aerial sightings that cannot be explained?
Oh, most definitely, yes.
Yeah. Is there a sort of percentile there somewhere that...
I'd say about 90% we can explain, 10% on average we can't, for various reasons. They may be put in too late, insufficient information, some are hoaxes, but definitely some we cannot explain.
Yeah. It's a fairly unusual thing, and we appreciate it very much that we can talk to you, because it's, I think, fairly rare that you give interviews at all.
Correct.
Thank you. What's the official policy that I think we should establish?
Yes, I think so. In the early 1950s, about the mid-1950s, the government of Australia, along with the governments of America and United Kingdom, thought there might be some threat to national security with the sightings of all these peculiar happenings. So they asked the RAAF to investigate all the reports and come up with the facts. And after about 10 or 12 years, we could not produce any information that suggested there were any interlopers from outer space. The 10% or so unexplained, we couldn't explain, but on the other hand, they didn't suggest any interlopers.
The one thing, of course, that the UFO societies say to me is that they believe that the RAAF is passing information to the USAF and other countries. Is that true?
Not exactly. We don't have any direct liaison with the USAF or the RAF, but certainly we get inquiries from overseas, from the UFO societies, from people, and we will answer them. If they want information on our sightings, then we'll send it to them. It is possible that some of these reports will filter their way back to the USAF, but we have no direct liaison.
That was the military air arm point of view. What about the civilian aviation scene? This confidential report from a civil airline captain was given to us reporting an incident that took place over Western Australia in 1976.
The Department of Transport knew of no known traffic in the vicinity, and the Met Office knew of no possible cause for turbulence. If the turbulence we hit was caused by an object, I'd estimate it was moving at, say, between Mach 2.5 to Mach 3. That's around 2,000 miles an hour. Passengers were hurt, and the stewardess was off for 6 months, and with an injured back, and seats were broken.
We also spoke to a local air traffic controller who wishes to remain anonymous.
I've been a radar controller for something over 10 years, and during that time I've seen several returns on the radar screen. They appear out of nowhere and they disappear, and they don't appear to be able to be explained by the stock answers which we can put to such returns, such as flocks of birds, balloons moving downwind. Some of these returns have been moving against the prevailing winds. Nothing as dramatic as perhaps the air traffic controllers in the States have, where they've actually been able to investigate such sightings with aircraft. Nothing as spectacular as that. Nonetheless, something that I can't explain.
And from Kalgoorlie Airport last year, a report from the duty meteorologist.
The UFO passed across the sky from the northeast to the southwest, not directly overhead, but a little to the south of me. The object looked oval from my viewing angle. It appeared in size about half that a 5-cent coin would be when held at arm's length. It was white, and the whiteness seemed brightest at the edges, which weren't sharply defined. There was no sound, and not knowing the size of the object, it was pretty impossible to estimate its altitude. The UFO took about 10 seconds from when I first sighted it in the northeast to when it appeared to stop in the southwest at about 40 to 45 degrees elevation. It seemed to stay there for about 5 seconds. Then it seemed to just vanish instantly without moving from the spot.
With a jumbo cargo of over 300 people, the responsibility on the pilot is tremendous. Did they ever see anything unusual?
Flying on Eastern Airlines from LA to New Orleans, and my production designer, who was on the airplane with me, was talking to the stewardesses about the movie we were making, and he mentioned to one of the stewardesses that it was a film about dealing, with UFOs. And the stewardess apparently went into the cabin and mentioned this to the pilot, and all of a sudden this big steely gray-haired guy with wings on his chest comes out, the pilot of the airplane. They point me out. He sits down next to me, and he said, will this be a serious movie, or is this just going to be a comedy or a sci-fi? And I said, no, we were taking the subject very serious. And then, knowing that I wasn't about to laugh in his face and ridicule what he was about to tell me, he sat down. He told me 2 experiences he had while flying with Eastern. One was a nocturnal light that traveled very, very quickly across his glide path. It startled everybody because of its speed. It wasn't a shooting star. It wasn't up there. It was eye level and moving very, very, very quickly. Something that was passing very close across his bow.
In the shadow of some of the world's tallest buildings, we were told of the most dramatic UFO experience that a human being has claimed so far.
So we're traveling along when suddenly a very strange looking maneuvering craft started following us for several miles. In an area called Indian Head, this craft left the highway, left the top of the mountain, came out over the highway and stopped in midair. And we could see it through the binoculars. Curved windows, red light on each side. Now Barney decided to get out and try to identify this craft. And he saw a group of human-like figures standing in the window looking down at him. And he had the feeling that he was being told to keep looking, don't be afraid, no harm's going to come to you. And at that point, the craft started to descend. Barney was filled with fear, thinking he was going to be captured. He ran back to the car, and we took off speeding down the highway. We heard a series of beeping sounds. And a few miles beyond this, we heard a second series of beeping sounds. Now later, in our investigation of this, we began to realize that we could not remember what had happened between the 2 series of beeping sounds.
When the story leaked out, an eminent psychologist placed Betty and Barney into deep hypnosis.
The hypnosis proved that Barney and I had been captured and taken on board a UFO. After the first series of beeping sounds, we were speeding down the highway. Barney left the main highway onto a side road, and then a sudden left-hand turn onto a very narrow woods road. The beings whom he had seen on board the craft were now standing in the middle of this road, and the car motor stalled. Barney was trying to start the car. It wouldn't start. They separated, came up, and took us out of the car in 2 groups. They took us to a path in the woods to where the craft was on the ground. Took us on board, took us into separate rooms, gave us physical examinations. And during this examination, we learned they had put a cup-like instrument on Barney's abdomen. Now, later, when we returned home, Barney developed a pattern of warts in a perfect circle. And we never knew until the hypnosis that was the spot where this cup-like instrument was put onto him.
Well, you're one of the few people to have met aliens. What do they look like?
They all had very, very large eyes, very small nose, thin slit for a mouth, no hair, no eyebrows, eyelashes, and no this part of the ear that we could see.
Carried the title 3 miles up, flying saucers.
This year marks the 30th anniversary of the advent of the flying saucer. And that is a most unfortunate term, in my opinion, because it invites ridicule. It opens the door to a great deal of buffoonery and lampooning. It had a perfectly good history, because when Kenneth Arnold described the motions of the discs that he had
performing here once they're here. Many people think that you can't get here from there. The fact of the matter is that there are published studies by reputable engineers and scientists in good technical journals showing that trips to nearby stars, and I don't worry about the distant ones, are feasible with reasonable round-trip time, shorter than a person's lifetime, without violating any of the laws of physics, and using staged fission or fusion propulsion systems, on both of which I have worked. Now, we physically tested fission nuclear propulsion systems when I was at West.
And he said that it was like skipping a saucer over water. But some reporter thought that was a very clever term, and flying saucers were born. But it is really too bad, because it has caused a great deal of jokes and so forth. For instance, one common expression is that if you want to see a flying saucer, just goose the waitress.
What do experts believe UFOs look like?
Typically, we're dealing with apparently, these are cases, landing trace cases, where a UFO is seen on or near the ground, and after it leaves, one finds physical changes produced in the environment. If you look at those cases, and one researcher has collected more than 1,000 such cases from 55 countries, and they're similar, whether you're dealing with sightings in Australia, New Zealand, you got the same landing traces as in the United States, as in South Africa, as in Canada, England, France, all over the world. There aren't any laws of physics that stand in the way of flying saucers, either getting here from other star systems or be round, symmetric, disc-shaped objects, definite size, shape, surface texture, bigger in diameter than they are in thickness, protuberances that might be landing gears or antenna windows, might be decorations too, we don't really know. Things with definite size, shape, surface texture. There are other reports of things that are cylindrical, long cigar-shaped objects. And if you look at the landing cases, and of course I'm most concerned with landing cases, because then we have something to work with.